Welcome to Loyola University Chicago's Be the Change Implementation Science Seminar Series. The Parkinson School of Health Sciences and Public Health, Loyola University of Chicago, in partnership with the Institute for Translational Medicine, offers monthly seminars to promote implementation science to improve translational science and health outcomes. Our guest speakers are researchers and practitioners in implementation and dissemination. From different lenses, we will learn about theory and use cases.
My name is Fran Weaver, and I'm the Program Director of Implementation Science at the Parkinson School at Loyola. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Saul Weiner, who will be presenting today. Dr. Weiner is the Deputy Director of the Center of Innovation for Complex Chronic Care at the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center. He is also a professor of medicine, pediatrics, and medical education at the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Medicine. And I have had the opportunity to work with Saul for, 15 years or more on work that he's been doing around contextualization of care, which you'll get to hear about today. So Saul is going to be talking about application of a stepped-wedge trial design to assess a provider intervention to enhance contextualization of care. So I'll turn it over to you, Saul.
Thank you, Fran. Fran, it's been more than 15 years. You're losing track of time.
Must be my advanced age.
Exactly. We have worked together a very long time. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to share my slides here. Let's see how this goes. In order to talk to you about stepped-wedge trial design, in my experience with it, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about my research. And I don't want this talk to be about my research, but I have to give you some background on it in order for what follows to make sense. I've been studying a concept called contextualization of care and contextual error for 20 years. And what this has to do with is how clinicians make decisions when providing patient care and when those patients are dealing with life issues that are essential to consider in order for a treatment plan to make sense. So for instance, if you're caring for a patient who's lost control of their asthma because they can't afford an expensive brand name inhaler, you're not going to be effective until you figure out that that's the problem, that their asthma's gotten worse because they're not taking a medicine because they can't afford it. Or it might be that a patient is not able to follow a treatment plan because they've lost critical caregiver support or because they have a competing responsibility and they're working the night shift. And so my team has been interested in how treatment plans can look good on paper, but actually be completely inappropriate because while they seem clinically correct, they're just not going to work for that patient because of some life issue that the treatment plan has failed to address, to come up with a workaround. And so many years ago, I partnered with Alan Schwartz, who's a cognitive psychologist, and we started looking at this as a quality issue. And we started looking at whether physicians make these contextual errors. A contextual error is basically a treatment plan that looks right. It's consistent with research evidence, but it's just not appropriate given what we know about that patient's life situation. And we came up with a framework for studying this in which we invited veterans, and this work was done mostly in the VA, invited veterans to audio record their visits. And then we developed a system of coding those audios for whether the physician had picked up on and addressed critical life context. And we came up with a pretty rigorous way of doing that so that there was a lot of objectivity, a lot of inter-rater agreement as to how the encounter was coded. And we also learned that this coding system was valid in that it was predictive of how that patient was going to do at 6 months. So for instance, if the physician didn't pick up on the fact that a patient had stopped taking a medication because they couldn't afford it, or their fingers were arthritic and they couldn't give themselves the insulin, or whatever the contextual issue was, if the physician picked up on that and came up with a workaround, pre-filled syringes, lower cost medication, whatever, not surprisingly, that patient would have often resolved that presenting issue at the follow-up visit. So anyway, so we spent years developing this whole framework. And one of the things we learned is that when we essentially share our audio recorded and analyzed data with physicians, they would learn from it. And so it became an intervention. So we call that audit and feedback. where we would invite, in this case, veterans to audio record their visits with their doctors. We would code that data for whether the physician had made a contextual error or not, and what it specifically was. We would share that data with the physicians, and we would do it on a recurring basis, on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, so physicians could just constantly get these reminders of whether they were picking up on context or missing it, and we're able to show that that was an effective way of changing physician practice. And so that became an intervention. And I've just literally summarized 20 years of work for you. So this is a very mammoth research program. I'm going to give you just a little bit more background on that, but then show you how we ended up utilizing a stepped-wedge design to basically study this as an intervention across many VAs for testing whether we could actually improve care, improve healthcare outcomes. So to be a little bit more specific, now that I've kind of given you the very 30,000 foot overview, contextualizing care is the process of adapting research evidence to patient context. A contextual error occurs when a care plan is inappropriate given a particular patient's life context. Now, contextualizing care is a four-step process. It begins with recognizing contextual red flags, which are any clue that a patient is struggling with a life issue that might be impacting their care. Asking them about it, we call that contextual probing, which is any attempt to find out, if the patient, for instance, if the clue is that the patient has not been refilling a medication, a probe might be, hey, Mr. Jones, I've noticed you haven't been refilling your medication. Can you tell me more about that? Are you having trouble affording it? Is it giving you side, whatever? That would be a probe. A contextual factor is anything in a patient's life situation that is impacting their care, what they tell you when you ask them those questions. And then a contextualized care plan is a care plan that takes contextual factors into account so that the care will be effective. And so what we realized is that this was a simple four-step framework for tracking, when we listened to audio recordings, whether a physician had noticed a red flag, probed it, elicited the underlying life issue, and then attempted to address it in the care plan. If physicians drop the ball at any of these points, essentially, you can end up with a contextual error. So essentially, if I were to give you an example, I would say, and this is from an audio recording, a patient with diabetes commented that he was not checking his feet at home as had been recommended. The provider did not ask him why. The patient went on to say that he didn't care whether or not he developed problems with his feet because of his diabetes. He then said that he was, quote, the kind of person who doesn't take care of themselves. Okay, so we would code this and then in this case, the provider did not explore with the patient why he felt this way about himself. Was he depressed? Has he always felt this way? So again, this is from an audio recording. We have a team that audio codes these and breaks each recording into these four elements. And then we share the data with physicians on a recurring basis. And this becomes essentially an intervention to really help them get better at this, to make them more alert to these issues that they are frequently missing. But just to parse it a little bit here, you can see that it's a red flag that a patient would just comment on something like this, right? And you would hope that the bride would say, well, hey, how come you're not checking your feet? Okay, and so forth. And so this is really the logic that we've used that's been the driver behind our research. Again, I also want to share this with you as well, because this is going to be important to what we talk about later, which is that we found that life context can be conveniently sorted into 12 broad domains. The 6 on the left are life circumstance domains. So for instance, if a patient has a transportation problem and they can't get to work, or if they can't afford something, that would be an access to care issue. If they're caring for a sick family member or they're working the night shift, that would be competing responsibility issues. So there are many different things that could be going on in a person's life that would fall into each of these buckets. And the 6 on the left are just literally life circumstances, things that happen in patients' lives that can affect their ability to manage their care. The ones on the right are drivers of a patient's behavior. There are things happening in the patient's head. So for instance, if a patient, if their emotional state is that they're depressed, and when they're depressed, they've lost interest in caring for themselves. So they stop taking their diabetes medication. So the diabetes goes out of control. They may present to you with poorly controlled diabetes, but the underlying issue, the context, is that they have depression. And you're not going to be able to manage the diabetes until you figure out that the context is the depression and you manage the depression. So that's what we mean by context in this case. So this framework also became very important, and I'll be showing you again how this falls into the step-wedge stuff that we're going to get to shortly. So contextual errors are cognitive errors, and they occur either because the clinician is inattentive to contextual red flags, that a contextual factor might account for a healthcare issue, or they're aware of the contextual factor but don't address it in the care plan. So to apply that here, I think yeah. So let me just run through this one more case. A patient with diabetes commented that he was not checking his feet at home as had been recommended. This is the case we just looked at, okay? The provider did not ask why. Again, the patient went on to say what you heard. The provider didn't explore it. So again, the point we're trying to make here is that physicians drop the ball in just one of two places. They either fail to probe a contextual red flag, or they fail to take a contextual factor into account in their care plan. So what you're seeing here is that when we're trying to create an intervention, we're going to want to be sharing with physicians where they drop the ball when we analyze audio recordings of their encounters. And just to give you an idea of the scale of this, we've had veterans audio record well over 10,000 visits for us at this point. So we've done this on quite a large scale across in a number of places, ranging from Chicago to Cleveland to Los Angeles to Milwaukee and so forth. So how do you detect contextual errors? To do that, you have to audio record these visits, and you have to analyze encounters utilizing this method that we developed called content coding for contextualization of care, which extracts 4 elements from each encounter: a contextual red flag, a contextual probe, contextual factor, and a contextualized care plan, which is just what I was showing you. So basically, we can train non-clinicians to listen to these audio recorders and to access the patient's chart. And we have like a 45-page coding manual. And so it takes a while, but they can learn pretty quickly with good training to have about 85% inter-rater agreement as to whether a care plan was contextualized. So this is a pretty objective measure. And that's important for obviously for the assessment that we're going to be talking about in a moment. Our research has shown that these contextual errors really matter. We found that in about 40% of real outpatient visits, real ambulatory visits, effective care depends on identifying and addressing patient context. In about 40% of those, physicians overlook context, meaning there's a contextual error. These errors predict worse healthcare outcomes, as I think I gave you some examples of that. Contextualizing care has a number needed to treat of about 6, meaning that for every 6 times a physician contextualizes a care plan, there will be a better outcome. And you could look at that as glass half empty or glass half full. I see it as half full because very few interventions in medicine actually have an NNT that low. It's a pretty darn good outcome. And if you think about it, it has no side effects. It's not a drug. It's just a way of practicing, a way of approaching patient care. Contextual errors result in overuse and misuse of medical services with higher costs. When physicians are inattentive to context, they tend to order a lot of unnecessary tests and give patients, unnecessary interventions. There's a lot of variation from physician to physician. There's a lot of room for improvement here. And one of the most surprising findings is physicians who do this well don't actually take longer. So what I'm painting for you here is a huge opportunity to measure and improve quality of care with an intervention and to scale it. So the QI program, which forms the basis of the clinical trial that we're going to be looking at in the Stepped-Wedge, is basically like this. Patients volunteer to carry encrypted audio recordings into their visits. We were doing this in 6 cities around the country. The audio recordings are uploaded to a secure server and 4C coded for whether and how the care plan resulted in a contextual error contextualized care plan. The results are shared with clinicians, both individual examples and overall trends. Each report contains these 4-line summaries that I just showed you. So every audio recorded encounter that we code, we're like, here are the 4 steps that our coders noted. And, you either didn't drop the ball or you dropped it, in one of these 2 places. You didn't probe or you didn't address the contextual factor in your care plan. And then graphical data showing their performance at probing and contextualizing care over time. So again, an example here of a clinician probing a contextual factor revealed and no plan of care made. The patient says he hasn't been checking his sugars. The provider states, what's the hang up? The patient reveals that he doesn't like poking his finger with a needle. It's also discovered that the patient is taking the wrong dose of insulin, and the provider does not discuss preventing fingertip pain. The provider also doesn't probe further as to why the patient was taking the wrong dose. So I'm just trying to get here to the, okay. I just want to make sure, I want to see where the Stepped-Wedge stuff is coming up. All right. What we are able to show here is that this is an example of how we share data graphically, which is that we're able to show physicians how they're performing over time with feedback, the percentage of audio recordings in which the care plan was contextualized, and the percentage of times in which they probed a red flag. And with recurring feedback, you see an upward graph here, which improvement. We don't always see this, and this is done by clinic, so by cluster. And this is important because one of the things we're going to be talking about with these Stepped-Wedge designs is they're really intended as cluster studies. And a Stepped-Wedge study design is a type of cluster study, and it followed the more traditional parallel cluster study. And so the cluster here were these clinics where we would implement this intervention, inviting people to audio record their visits, sharing the data with them, and so forth. How's the data used? The reports we have clinical champions at each site. We essentially have them share the data at standing QI meetings that these clinics already have scheduled. We give them reflective exercises that they get continuing medical education and board recertification credit for completing. We expanded it to include nurses, pharmacists, and front desk clerks. And again, this is going to be relevant because when I show you the cluster trial that we designed, we actually had an enhanced and a standard form of feedback. And the enhanced form included these other professions, whereas the standard intervention did not. Participating patients are followed for several months after visit to see if the presenting problem improves. So we employ multiple methods of feedback in an effort to heighten self-awareness about the importance of paying attention to patient context and care planning. Now, as I said, we had two forms of feedback, and this is important because when we designed the Stepped-Wedge design, we ended up wanting to test, two levels of feedback, standard feedback and enhanced feedback. So standard feedback where basically we gave aggregate data to the physicians on their performance based on analysis of audio recordings of their visits. We added data for their residents. We gave at least monthly feedback, and the feedback reports were given to doctors with peer facilitation with a trained clinical champion. Then when we had enhanced feedback, we added CME credit with exercises, individual performance, individual physicians, the addition of nurses, pharmacists, and clerks, feedback including data on healthcare outcomes, weekly email blasts with contextual examples for recent audios, and a maintenance of certification credit for attending physicians. So as I said, we had two different levels of feedback, which again is not uncommon in Stepped-Wedge designs because you're really trying to figure out what's the sweet spot. So what were our research questions? Is audio recording visits and feeding the data back to clinical teams resulting in fewer contextual errors over time? If so, does the intensity of feedback matter, meaning standard versus enhanced feedback? 2, if the intervention results in fewer contextual errors, does it also result in improved healthcare outcomes? And if the intervention results in fewer contextual errors, does it also result in fewer unnecessary tests and treatments, meaning reduced misuse and overuse of medical services? Now, this turned out to be an ideal set of research questions for a Stepped-Wedge cluster randomized trial. This particular study design is increasingly widely used in the evaluation of service delivery. Again, we were delivering a service, a policy, or QI interventions delivered at the level of the cluster, like a primary care clinic or any other unit of interest. Stepped-Wedge is a pragmatic study design. Pragmatic trials evaluate the effectiveness of interventions in real-life conditions such that results can be generalized to practice settings. It utilizes random and sequential crossover of clusters from control to intervention until all clusters are exposed to the intervention. And it's not quite as it's not quite as objective as a randomized control trial or its kind of partner, which is parallel cluster studies, which is what preceded the Stepped-Wedge, since more clusters are exposed to the intervention towards the end of the study than its early stages. And as a result, the effect of the intervention might be confounded with any underlying temporal trend. And again, I'll talk a little bit about this more in a minute. When I was looking a little bit into the history of Stepped-Wedge, it's really taken off quite recently, like in the last, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years, but it goes back. The earliest Stepped-Wedge study was probably in the 1980s and what's referred to as the Gambia hepatitis intervention study. And what happened there is, that was the time where there was this new vaccine for hepatitis B, and it was already demonstrated that hepatitis B vaccine is effective at preventing hepatitis B. And so there was a desire to roll it out, in this case in Gambia. But what they didn't know is whether it could also prevent liver disease. And so they realized that they had an opportunity to answer that question because they were going to have to roll this out over this very large population. And so the thought was, okay, well, we obviously don't want to deny any, we don't want to delay or deny any group based on randomization from getting the intervention, because we already know that the intervention itself is critically effective for something we know that's really important, which is preventing hepatitis B. What we don't know is whether it also prevents chronic liver disease. So what we're going to do is pick a study design that allows everybody to benefit from the intervention for obvious reasons, but also allows us to answer an important research question with a rigorousness that is almost on par with an RCT. And the Stepped-Wedge is a form of RCT. It's not quite as definitive as an RCT, but it is classified in sort of same category as RCT. It is a clinical trial. It is randomized, and it's clustered. There are some differences, and one of them has to do with this idea of a temporal trend, which is that as you'll see, because it's a stepwise approach, you end up with this asymmetry, which I think is easier to illustrate with the diagram that we're about to see here. So in the study we did, and this is typical of what a Stepped-Wedge looks like. We ended up having 6 different sites around the country. And what you can see here is we had audit only. Audit only is where you're basically just collecting data, but you haven't started the intervention. And then in this case, we had standard feedback and then enhanced feedback. And you can see it's literally like a staircase. So that's what we mean by a Stepped-Wedge. As I said, the precursor of the Stepped-Wedge was a parallel cluster study. And then actually what followed after that was what was called the parallel cluster study with a baseline period. And then what followed after that was the Stepped-Wedge study. There's a wonderful paper that kind of gives the history of the kind of Stepped-Wedge. And I'll be sharing the reference with you a little bit later. But it was published in British Medical Journal in 2015. Actually, let me go back because I think I might have referenced it. Yeah, it's right down. It's Hemming. This is a really nice paper that kind of gives you the whole history of the Stepped-Wedge, the logic behind it, and also gets into some really important statistical considerations when you're trying to, figure out power calculations, and also you're looking at the impact of intercorrelations within clusters and how those intercorrelations affect the power calculations, because obviously if there's a lot of variation within your cluster, that's going to require larger sample sizes compared to if your clusters are more homogeneous. And so there are a lot of considerations like that you have to factor in with the Stepped-Wedge. And again, also the temporal effect, right? Because as you can see here, it is temporal. You have more, obviously everybody's participating here, and so you can't completely eliminate a temporal effect. There are ways in which you can try to mitigate the possibility that there are, kind of secular trends that are occurring over time that, could contaminate your findings. And again, this paper talks a little bit about how to control for those. So anyway, what we did is we sent. So basically, we ended up setting up this intervention at all of these sites around the country. But the way we did it, using the Stepped-Wedge approach, is we didn't introduce the intervention initially, with the exception of 2 sites. And this is an important caveat for our study, because before we actually began the study, we actually had developed the intervention at 2 sites. At one of those sites, we developed the standard intervention, and at the other site, we developed the enhanced intervention. And we wanted to include those in our studies. So these, obviously, we couldn't randomize, which, was a little bit of a caveat. Our study wasn't a perfect RCT, right? Because we're only able to randomize 4 of the sites. The other 2 sites were non-randomized because we were starting them with intervention. So anyway, in a pure Stepped-Wedge, all of this would be audit initially, right? You'd have just a pure audit. In other words, you have another pure audit period here. We weren't able to do that. But the point is that we at these new 4 sites initially, for a 7-month period, we just basically didn't have any feedback. We were just basically collecting baseline data. In other words, veterans were being invited to audio record their visits. We were coding that data for contextual error rates across each of these 4 sites without sharing any of that data with the clinicians themselves. So there was really, really no intervention, right? And then what started happening is at these 2 sites, we started providing standard feedback to them, which, as you saw in the previous chart, was those 4 or 5 things that we were doing, And then obviously in the next 6 months, we went to enhanced feedback. And then these 2 sites here started getting standard feedback. And then they too got enhanced feedback, right? So we were able to, obviously each site alone would just be, a longitudinal study, a pre-post, which would not be that useful because you'd have huge temporal effects. But the whole idea of clustering these, bringing these together, and also randomizing assignment, which is critical, is where you start to get your incredible power, where it starts to look like an RCT. And that's what makes this study design so ingenious. All right. And by the way, I don't mind being interrupted. I welcome it. So feel free. Always, let me just see if anyone's asking questions in the chat. Okay, I'm going to put the chat here. We'll have time for questions afterwards. All right. So in our study, we had patients audio record almost 4,500 visits for us with 666 providers in these clusters. What we found is that 67% of audio recordings contained at least one contextual red flag. 55% of contextual red flags were probed, and 57% of probes uncovered a contextual factor. Okay, so 67% of care plans were contextualized prior to feedback, in other words, in the audit phase, and 72 post-feedback, a significant improvement. When controlling for probing, clinicians were more likely to contextualize care plans in the enhanced than in the standard feedback condition. So we did see an added effect with the enhanced feedback. Good outcomes, meaning resolution of the red flag, occurred in 40% of non-contextualized care plans and 73% of contextualized care plans, a significant difference. Hospitalization rates decreased from 19 to 16.5% for patients seeing providers before and after they'd received feedback. So in other words, and approximately 987 hospitalizations were avoided at a cost of $25 million. So basically, the VA has this amazing data warehouse where you can just pull data from anywhere, essentially. And what we were able to show is that if we had these 666 providers, and what we were trying to do over time with this intervention is change the way they practice so that they would become contextualizers, essentially. And then all of these providers are obviously seeing lots of patients. So collectively, they're seeing a huge number of patients. And what we found was that there was this small decrease in hospitalization rates before versus after they'd received feedback. And the idea here behind it is that as they get better contextualizing care, the patients have better outcomes, and hospitalization rates fall a very small percent, I must say, but still significant when you're talking about that large a number with a significant benefit and an enormous return on investment. And this was a JAMA Network Open publication. We ended up publishing this Stepped-Wedge study pretty recently. It came out, and Fran's also an author on it. This was just like 2021, I think. Evaluation of, okay, so this is pretty much what it's a descriptor here. And by the way, they wouldn't allow us to use the word randomizing. We had to use the word quasi-randomized because of the fact that we had those 2 sites that were already, one was standard, one was enhanced feedback. So, I wanted to leave lots of time, for discussion, and sorry I had to talk so much about my own work here, but it's a complicated intervention. I think that again, I can't recommend enough the Hemming paper, which I think really nicely lays out a lot of the sophisticated sample size and power calculation issues when you're dealing with, and design considerations when you're dealing with a stepped wedge. They also give a lot of nice examples of stepped wedge trials that have been, done in recent years, and that are, and how they are sort of similar and different. I had the good fortune of having Alan Schwartz as our methodologist. Alan is outstanding at working with really with study designs like this, and also at doing a lot of the statistical work and making sure that we had appropriate power. So I'd like to pause. Also, Fran, I know you participated in this study as well. I don't know if there are things that you would like to add. I will share a few of the key points that Hemming and others made in their paper, which is just, as I said, intended to provide an overview. They say the Stepped-Wedge cluster randomized trial offers a randomized method of evaluation of an intervention delivered at the level of the cluster. In cases where randomization to either control or intervention arm is precluded, but randomization to a date of initiation is possible, it offers a means of a randomized evaluation in place of a less robust design. However, the design requires the fitting of more complex models than parallel designs, like parallel clusters is what they're referring to, and must adjust for underlying temporal trends, which we mentioned earlier. A Stepped-Wedge cluster randomized trial is likely to be the preferable study design when all or some of the following hold. And I won't mention all of them, but a few of them are really important and interesting. First, there is evidence already in support of the intervention. For example, known to be effective at individual level, but uncertain about policy level. Or there is resistance to a parallel design in which only half of the clusters receive the intervention, which of course would be the issue with, say, the Gambia study. You would not want to deny half the population the hepatitis B vaccine. The intervention is a service delivery or policy change that can be implemented without the need for individual participant consent. The outcome, or at least some important outcomes, may be available from routinely collected data so that individual participation for outcome data collection is not required. That is, no patient questionnaire. So this is really important, this passive component. Like we didn't have to enroll any patient in the study because the patients are already participating in the audit and feedback QI program at these sites. We're simply using that. Using that data to provide feedback. In other words, to introduce an intervention. And so it's passive. Otherwise, you'd be introducing biases, right? If some patients were saying yes or no, that would make it very difficult to do a study like this. What makes it feasible is that you're stepping in to assess a service and then use that data to introduce an intervention. They also say here, and I mentioned this earlier, that the intercluster correlation is anticipated to be high or cluster size is large, so that a cross-sectional Stepped-Wedge design is likely to be more efficient than the simple parallel cluster design. So that's, again, where we talk about if there is a lot of variation within each cluster, that's going to adversely affect, that's going to require a greater sample size. And finally, they say the reasons to be cautious about using a Stepped-Wedge cluster randomized to trial are, first, when the intercluster correlation is low, or the cluster size is small, the Stepped-Wedge cross-sectional design can be an inefficient study design compared with a simple parallel cluster design. Second, when the outcome requires individual participant data collection without blinding, lack of concealment of allocation is likely to mean a risk of differential selection for participant between arms. That's exactly what I was just saying a minute ago. So this wouldn't really work if we weren't stepping into a situation where veterans are already just volunteering to record their visits so that data can be collected without anything having to do with the intervention. And then finally, it's unlikely that clusters will be able to follow the randomization schedule. In that situation, it becomes a weaker study design. And we saw that a little bit in our study where we were unable to randomize two of the sites. So great. I just want to pause there and ask Fran if there are any comments or thoughts that you'd like to add, and we can certainly open it up.
Well, first of all, thank you, Saul, for a very interesting presentation. Two comments. One is, I don't think you mentioned this, Saul, but this was a hybrid design.
Yes.
Because you were collecting both the outcomes data as well as information about the implementation process itself. I should mention that because it's an implementation trial, you did a lot of upfront work to identify sites and ensure that they were ready to take on this particular project, that you needed to get buy-in from the clinicians and the leadership at the facilities, that the sites were agreeable to this being a quality improvement study, so that patients could audio tape the recordings of their encounters. And all of that was no small task. So there was a lot of upfront work. A lot of it was facilitated by the earlier work that you and the team had been doing. But just to let folks know, Saul and our team fought more than a few battles in terms of the audio record, getting the recordings audio recorded, and even the feedback process. So I didn't know if you wanted to say just a few words about just getting everything set up for implementation.
Yeah, and in fact, thank you. In fact, the Hemming paper actually talks very specifically about what they call the politics of these studies. So I'm glad you brought that up. The politics of these studies are real issues. When you're stepping in to assess something within the actual service delivery of an organization, and you have to use sometimes fairly intrusive methods of doing that. Obviously, it generates anxiety. In our particular study, and again, the Hemming paper talks about this, but in our particular study, it was a big issue because we were, basically the audio recording, inviting patients to audio record their visits with their doctors, and doctors were initially extremely anxious about that. And so we really had to come up, and we published about this with a set of principles that we adhered to that would just basically make them comfortable. There were 3 principles. One was that the default is that the audio recordings are de-identified. In other words, the names of doctors and patients are removed. And so in all the data we share, so they don't have to worry, because a lot of them were worried about, am I going to get in trouble if someone's listening to audio recording, blah, all that kind of anxiety people had. So we totally de-identified. Secondly, the second principle, and we call that the principle of safety. They had to feel safe. The second principle was that we wanted to make sure that there was no burden to the physician, like that there was nothing they had to do. And so the way this is structured is they just provide usual care, and all the feedback that they get actually occurs during their standing, PAC team meetings. Those are the patient-aligned care team meetings that the VA has had for years. So there's no extra thing they have to do. And then the third thing is we wanted them to actually have some direct value out of it. So in the enhanced feedback, we got it approved by the American Board of Internal Medicine, and that they would get board recertification credit called MOC, or Maintenance of Certification Credit, for participating. So a lot went into making this, fit the organizational culture, which I think is really, really important and essential for this type of work. The other thing that Fran mentioned, and I know Howard Gordon's going to be talking about this in an upcoming talk, is that the design we used was we collected both effectiveness and enhanced. I'm losing with that. So it's effectiveness and implementation. That's what I'm losing. So it was an effect. So just by way of background, when Fran uses the term hybrid, it means that you're collecting data both on effectiveness and on implementation. And in the hybrid design, there are actually sort of three levels of doing that. So in hybrid 1, essentially, and I'm not doing this by memory, but I think that it's I'm pretty sure this is correct. Almost all the measurement data you're collecting is effectiveness data. So you're really, really interested in spending most of your effort showing that the intervention is effective, and just a little bit of effort showing that, looking at issues like feasibility, implementation. And then in step 2, it's kind of balanced. And you're doing that because there's already quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of existing data that the intervention is effective. And so you really want to start to put more focus on measuring implementation. And then in a step 3 hybrid design, you're doing relatively little data collection on effectiveness. You're putting almost all of your energy into measuring and rigorously studying implementation, because at that point you have already very compelling data that the intervention is effective. And so I think in this particular study, based on where we were when we wrote the proposal, we already had pretty good data that the audit and feedback is effective, but we didn't have, we still needed more data, and we had very little data on implementation. So that's why we made this essentially a step 2 effectiveness implementation hybrid Stepped-Wedge trial design. So that's a real mouthful, but if you want to be very precise, that's actually the technical description of what we did. And when we were submitting the proposal for funding, and it had to go through several rounds, there was disagreement among the review committees around whether this should be a step 1, a step 2, or a step 3. And it was actually, we kind of went round robin, because I believe that in the first submission, we'd wanted it to be a step 2, and they thought it needed to be a step 1, and we made a step 1, and then later committee wanted it to be a step 2. So we kind of went back and forth before finally, we got a score that was fundable. I could tell long tales about the political challenges we had with this study, which Fran knows all too well. When you're working within a very large organization, and the VA is a very large organization, you can hit all kinds of barriers. Like in this case, we had to deal with a union, which was very concerned about the audio recording, and they contested it, and so on and so forth. So it was kind of a long road. But we did actually manage to get those issues ironed out, and so we were able to do the study and complete it.
So Saul, we have several questions.
Yep.
I'm just going to ask the folks, they're in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the folks if they would just repeat their questions. So first up, we have Susan Fisher.
Yep.
Hi, sorry. Excuse me. My question was, it looked like you were assigning treatments based on sites, but you had and it looked in the little bit of results that you showed, you were giving the results of encounters. So the encounters were clustered within providers, and then providers are clustered within site. And I wondered, statistically, was there management of the encounters within providers? Because obviously those results would be biased by the provider, him or herself.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So Alan, and again, I have to confess, I'm not a statistician, and Alan did do that. And it's in the JAMA paper. But you're absolutely right. That's important. And that's part of, and in the Hemming paper, they talk a little bit about, about the necessity of doing that.
I'll check out the Hemming paper there. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. Next, Lisa Burkhart.
Hi, Saul.
Hi.
My question relates to your data collection strategies. Were there, when you collected data, were those just with face-to-face encounters, or did you also include telehealth? And if you did do that, was there a difference in the type of care delivery, and how did you control for that in your analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our study was done before the pandemic hit, and I say that because, as you probably know, telehealth skyrocketed with the pandemic, and so all of our encounters were face to face. We actually have a study proposal now that's under review that will compare face to face with telehealth, and we've actually come up with an experimental study design. We're actually going to be using unannounced. We're going to be using standardized patients. So what we're doing in that study is the physicians. The nice thing about a standardized patient model is you can literally have, quote unquote, the same patient interact with multiple physicians, and you can control a variable, like say compare how the physician performs when it's a telehealth interaction versus when it's a face-to-face interaction with literally the same patient, standardized. And that's that's something you can't do with real patients, right? Because they're real. They're no two visits are the same. So we're actually in the process of hoping to do a study where we'll be looking at telehealth versus face to face. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's I think the part that relates to your question.
Exciting. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Albert Vaughn.
Hi, Saul.
Hi.
Hey, quick question. And this may be in the political realm, but when you're doing these kind of step-wedge studies, how much do you have to sort of prevent other things happening at the same time? Like, I mean, now that you've done this step-wedge within these clinics, can you go back to them? did you have to be, who's policing what other contaminating studies? And then can patient level RCTs take place within the step wedge design if it's unrelated to the topic that you're studying?
So I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm totally answering the question here, but if you're asking about how those things you can't control affect
Yes.
the findings of your study while you're doing the study, because if it's while you're doing the study, the way, of course, you're controlling for that is that you've randomized sites as to when they get the intervention, and by doing that, because that's random, and therefore some sites randomly are not getting the intervention while others are over time. You are hopefully going to be controlling for anything that is happening in the world that could affect your study results. That like what I call a secular trend, right? Anything that's happening over time that could potentially contaminate. Now, it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but that's the theory behind
let's say a site took up an advanced care planning communication intervention, like somewhere in the middle of the study.
Yes,
I mean that would affect the interpretation of what you see over time. And
no, absolutely. So again, and this is a great point. So if that happened at just one site, and you don't have enough sites, and that site happens to have been randomized in such a way that it's not getting the intervention, that the intervention is happening at the same time as this new thing that you've introduced, that could undermine that could confound the findings of your study, right? So I think and of course the effect of such a thing is going to be diminished the more sites you have and the fewer sites are affected by this thing that you're hypothesizing, right? So if you had 20 sites and only one of them implemented this new thing that could potentially affect your results, it's probably not going to have a much of an impact.
Okay.
And by the way, that would be true even for a traditional randomized cluster trial, right? And that's in the nature of implementation research. Like if you just would have parallel cluster study, you could still have the same problem with that as well.
Got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
But no, these are real limitations that can occur.
Okay, we have a question from Howard Gordon.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
You're here.
So I'm just interested in sort of what happens when you're thinking about designing something like this. And so most of us are kind of trained on randomized trials, and so we think about comparing patients to control groups. But in this one, there were three groups. There was the control group, or they got nothing. They got standard and then enhanced. And then it looked to me like not all the sites went through each group. And I'm wondering how you picked the stepped wedge that you picked, and whether you could just say some things about why the design it looks like it looks.
Yeah. So as I said, there was two of the sites we didn't have a choice over because before the study ever started, one of them was already getting an intervention which was standard, and the other one was getting an intervention that was enhanced, which is actually how we ended up really inventing those terms. They were the impetus for doing this study. And then the other four sites we randomized, and so we just basically randomized what the step wedge would be like. However you want to define whatever the randomization was. That's obviously it's a small. We had four sites, but one was in Cleveland, one was in Los Angeles, one was in Milwaukee, and so forth. And that was randomized just in terms of when they would get the standard and enhanced feedback. So that's pretty much how it worked. Now it would have been nice if we had 15 sites or 20 sites, right? That would have reduced the possible contamination effect if one of them had, for instance, introduced some new program that could tip the scales on our proposed intervention. Now we were following all sites very closely, and that didn't happen as far as we're aware. We were making site visits, and we had a research team at each of the sites, and we had clinical champions, and nothing happened at any of these sites. that any of us are aware of that would have had any impact on, or any expected impact on, the variables of interest. So, and I think if there had been, if like one or two of them had introduced some, huge, coordinated care program, I think we would have had an ethical obligation to include that in our, in our publication. And I think that would just be, that's just that. And I think that's a good point. I mean, I think anyone who does these types of studies, and it's actually not in the Hemming paper, but I think it's a great point. If you're doing one of these studies and something happens at your sites that, you as an investigator believe could account for any changes or effects of interest, you have an obligation to share that with your readers.
Okay, looks like we have one more question from Emily Van Gompel.
Yeah, hi. I was actually curious about, I guess, the time between sort of flipping the switch between control and intervention, and the time you would expect your intervention to actually have effect, so a washout period. And I was curious how you would determine that. So I'm imagining any one patient audio recording on any one day with a clinician, and then that clinician gets their feedback. But is there a certain number of feedback sessions that they have to get before you start saying, okay, they've received their intervention? And did you have to account for that at all in your analysis? And how did you decide that?
That's a great question. So what we did is, because we had been running this intervention at 2 sites for quite some time, the ones that ended up being the ones we couldn't control, we had actually published a number of papers on this intervention at that point. We had a lot of data. I showed you those graphs where we could see the rate at which, how long it took for the intervention to change physician practice. And so when we wrote the proposal, Alan, our methodologist, basically used that data to plan the Stepped-Wedge, right? To make determinations about how long we'd need to did you talk about the wash, how long we'd need to run the audit, how long we would need to keep each site a particular Stepped-Wedge for the intervention to likely be effective, given the data that we had from, our prior work. And so basically that's what we worked off of, just the data we had that, was for the same intervention. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And so then did you get rid of the washout period data, I guess, in your analysis? Like, was that considered neither control or intervention, or did you use that data in your analysis?
How are you using the term washout here?
I guess I'm trying to get at that period where it's before the full effect of the audit of the feedback has we hypothesized has come into play. So before that, but after they've started to receive feedback, if that makes sense. So what do you do with that period of time in your data, or are you not collecting data during that period of time?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. Yes. And let me repeat back to you, because I think I see what you're saying. So basically, at any stepped point, so basically at audit, there's no intervention. We're just collecting baseline data. Then we turn on, we go to standard feedback, at a particular site, right? Now, your point is that you don't start to get an effect the moment you start sharing the data with patients. And in fact, for with physicians, for several months, they're probably not, that influenced by the data you're sharing with them. Maybe they're just like, oh, whatever this, who the hell cares, whatever. And then after a while, they start saying, maybe I should pay more attention to this. I really am, making some serious mistakes here. And then by, month 6, they're really convinced. They're like, wow, this is really important. This is really something I need to pay a lot of attention to, right? And so we actually just took that entire block from the moment we turned the intervention on to the full length of that intervention as the intervention period, which in many ways biases the study in a way that weakens the effect of our intervention, right? Because we really didn't take into account a washout period. In other words, we just took that whole block and averaged it and said this was the effect on physician decision-making during that 6-month block, even though we understand that the effect was probably very weak at the beginning and quite strong near the end. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yep.
So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I want to be mindful that people are probably running to other meetings after this. So again, I want to thank Dr. Weiner for his presentation. I think it was very, very interesting, and we had some great questions. So next month, we will have our next seminar where we will dive in deeper to what a hybrid trial is, and we'll hear from Dr. Gordon on that. And thank you all for your time today. Have a good afternoon.